Her legs ached as she kept pace with him, but she refused to slow down. He moved with precision, his every step deliberate, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The battle in the streets had ended, but the war had not. More soldiers would come. They always did. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't look back. Safe house. Not far. She doubted there was anywhere truly safe in Solara, but she didn't argue. The alternative was staying in the open, where the Dominion would sweep through again, this time with reinforcements. They wove through the ruins like ghosts, avoiding open roads, keeping to the cover of collapsed structures and smoke-cloaked alleyways. Vera had spent her life sneaking through the city, but Elias moved differently, not just with stealth, but with purpose. He wasn't running from the Dominion. He was moving toward something. She swallowed. "You said you were going to end this." He slowed just enough to glance at her. "I did." "How?" His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to the path ahead. "By finishing what I started." The answer gave her no clarity, only more questions. Before she could press him, he raised a fist, signaling her to stop. Vera dropped low beside him, pressing herself into the rubble. She couldn't see what he saw, but his posture had changed. Shoulders squared, muscles taut, his grip on his rifle shifting ever so slightly. A single Dominion drone hovered just ahead, its mechanical limbs twitching as it scanned the remains of a collapsed market square. Its sensors glowed a dull blue, sweeping in slow arcs. Elias tensed, his fingers brushing over the side of his rifle. Vera held her breath, watching. And then, without warning, he moved. It was over in seconds. A sharp crack, a burst of light, and the drone collapsed in a heap of sparking wires. The kill was clean, efficient, silent enough that the sound was swallowed by the distant roar of destruction. He turned to her. "Move." She didn't hesitate. They hurried past the wreckage, weaving through the debris, their steps muffled by the layers of dust and ash coating the ground. The safe house, if it could even be called that, was a forgotten bunker buried beneath a collapsed transit station. Elias led her down a crumbling staircase, past shattered support beams and broken tiles, until they reached a rusted metal door half hidden behind debris. He pressed a hand against a scanner embedded in the frame. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hiss, the door unlocked. Inside, the space was small and reinforced, its walls lined with crude weapon racks and salvaged supplies. It smelled of metal and dust, but it was the first place Vera had stepped into in days that didn't feel like a graveyard. Elias secured the door behind them, locking it with practiced ease. Then he turned, setting his rifle down on a nearby crate. She studied him carefully. His armor was battered, streaked with dirt and dried blood, but he barely seemed to notice. He moved like a man who had been fighting for so long that he had forgotten how to stop. She finally asked the question she had been holding onto since they met. "Why are you really here?" He exhaled, running a hand down his face. He hesitated, then motioned for her to sit. She didn't argue. "I was sent here on a mission," he said at last. His voice was quieter now, heavier. "I wasn't supposed to get involved. Just gather intel. But then I saw what they were doing." Vera's throat tightened. She knew what he meant. She had seen it too, the executions, the destruction, the systematic erasure of everything her people had built. "I couldn't walk away," he continued. "Not from this." Something in his expression shifted. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. It burned in his eyes, raw and unrelenting. "You're just one soldier," she said. His mouth twitched, almost amused. "Yeah, but I'm a stubborn one." She almost laughed. Almost. But the weight of reality pressed down too hard. He leaned forward, his tone serious. "There's a resistance cell still fighting in the outskirts. They don't have the numbers to push back, but they have intel. Dominion Command is set up in the Capitol Tower. That's where we end this." Vera's stomach twisted. "That place is a fortress." He nodded. "Yeah. That's why I need to get inside." The sheer insanity of the idea nearly made her choke. The Dominion's central command hub was the most heavily guarded location on the planet. Even with the Resistance's help, a direct assault would be suicide. But Elias wasn't smiling. He wasn't making grand claims or empty boasts. He was simply stating a fact. "You're serious. I don't say things I don't mean." The evening air carried the familiar hum of city life as Keanu Reeves stepped into a small, family-run diner on the quieter side of Los Angeles. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers filled the space, mingling with the low chatter of the handful of customers scattered around. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, a welcome escape from the demands of Hollywood. Keanu preferred places like this, where there were no flashing cameras or invasive stares. He wasn't just an actor in the public eye here. He was just another customer, looking for a warm meal and a bit of quiet. As he settled into a corner booth near the window, he let out a slow breath, stretching his arms slightly before glancing around the diner. The decor was simple, with faded photographs of old Hollywood actors hanging on the walls, their black and white smiles frozen in time. The laminated menus showed signs of wear, their edges curling from years of use. It was a modest establishment, but there was a charm to it, something nostalgic, something real. As he reached for the menu, his attention was drawn to a young waiter moving hurriedly between tables. The young man, barely in his 20s, wore a uniform that looked a size too big on his lean frame. His white shirt was neatly tucked in, but there were faint creases, as though he hadn't had the time, or the energy, to iron it properly. His name tag read Ethan. Ethan moved with the kind of urgency that came from being stretched too thin. His steps were quick, but his posture betrayed exhaustion. There was something about the way he carried himself, shoulders slightly hunched, jaw clenched as if bracing for impact, that told Keanu this wasn't just an ordinary busy night for him. His hands trembled slightly when he set down plates, and though he forced a polite smile whenever he approached a customer, there was an undeniable weariness in his eyes. Keanu watched as Ethan hurried over to an older couple, balancing a tray with visible effort. As he leaned forward to place a cup of coffee in front of the woman, the cup wobbled slightly before settling on the table. The woman barely noticed, offering a distracted nod of thanks before continuing her conversation with her husband. Ethan exhaled, relieved that he hadn't spilled anything, then quickly turned toward another table where a group of impatient teenagers tapped their fingers against the wooden surface, waiting for refills. As Ethan approached Keanu's table, he wiped his hands on his apron, his gaze fixed downward. "Good evening, sir. Welcome. Can I get you something to drink?" His voice was polite but quiet, as if he was trying to conserve energy. Keanu looked up at him and offered a warm smile. "Take your time. No rush." Ethan blinked, seemingly caught off guard by the kindness in the response. Most customers wanted efficiency, speed. They rarely spared a moment to acknowledge the person taking their order. "But yeah, of course. What can I get for you?" Ethan asked, forcing another smile as he pulled a small notepad from his apron pocket. Keanu glanced at the menu briefly before deciding on something simple, a burger and black coffee. As Ethan jotted down the order, Keanu noticed the faint dark circles under his eyes, the stiffness in his movements, the way his fingers trembled ever so slightly when he held the pen. "You doing okay, man?" Keanu asked casually. Ethan hesitated for just a second, his fingers tightening around the notepad. "Yeah, just a long shift," he answered, his voice lacking conviction. Keanu knew that look. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, stress, worry, maybe something even heavier. He had seen it before, in people struggling to hold things together, in those trying to hide the weight of their battles behind forced smiles. Ethan quickly nodded, as if trying to dismiss any lingering questions, and took a step back. "I'll get that right out for you." Keanu watched as he disappeared behind the counter, where the kitchen doors swung open and shut as servers rushed in and out. From his seat, he could see Ethan reach for the coffee pot, But his hands hesitated for a fraction of a second before he steadied himself and poured. A sharp voice rang out from the kitchen, someone calling for him to move faster. Ethan flinched, murmured an apology, and hurried to pick up another order. Keanu leaned back in his seat, watching the young man work, a quiet sense of concern growing in his chest. Something told him that Ethan's struggles didn't end when his shift was over. The clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation filled the diner as Ethan moved through the space, weaving between tables with the practiced but tired rhythm of someone who had been doing this far too long. His movements were quick, efficient, but there was no ease to them. Every step seemed measured, every action carried out with an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. Keanu continued to watch him, his instincts telling him there was more to the young man's exhaustion than just a long shift. Something about the way he worked, the quiet, hurried desperation in his actions, felt familiar in a way Keanu couldn't quite place. It was a look he had seen in people struggling to keep their heads above water, trying to push forward even as life pulled them down. A few tables away, a family with 2 children had just finished their meal. The parents were busy gathering their things while their young son played with his spoon, tapping it rhythmically against the edge of his plate. Ethan approached, offering a polite smile as he reached for the empty dishes. "Thank you for coming in tonight," he said, his voice even but subdued. The mother barely acknowledged him as she slipped on her coat. The father murmured a distracted thanks before pulling out his wallet. The little boy, however, seemed fascinated by the sound his spoon was making and gave it one last, enthusiastic flick, sending it flying off the table and straight toward Ethan. The metal utensil struck Ethan's wrist, causing him to jerk back in surprise. It wasn't a painful impact, but the sudden movement made his already unsteady hands falter. The plate he had been holding tilted in his grasp, slipping through his fingers before he could stop it. Time seemed to slow as the dish plummeted toward the floor. The sharp sound of shattering porcelain cut through the air, turning heads in the small restaurant. Pieces of the plate scattered at Ethan's feet, some skidding under nearby tables. A hush fell over the space, all eyes briefly landing on the scene before them. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a split second, he stood there, shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. Then, as if reality had slammed back into him, he quickly crouched down and began gathering the shards with trembling hands. The manager, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gruff demeanor, wasted no time in approaching. His voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Ethan, how many times do I have to tell you to be more careful?" Ethan flinched at the sharpness of the words, but kept his head down as he continued picking up the pieces. "I'm sorry, sir. It was an accident." The manager scoffed. "That's the problem with you. Always accidents. You need to focus. I can't have you making a mess every shift." Keanu, who had been silently observing up until now, felt something inside him tighten. The tone, the sheer dismissiveness, the way Ethan shrank under the man's words. It was enough to make his fingers curl into fists beneath the table. He had seen this kind of treatment before. People who worked hard, who gave everything they had, only to be berated over something minor. People who weren't allowed to be human, to make mistakes. The other customers, now sensing that the spectacle was over, turned back to their meals. Conversations resumed, and the moment was already fading into the background of the night. But Keanu wasn't about to let it slide. He stood up slowly, his presence commanding yet calm. The manager barely noticed him at first, still too busy scowling at Ethan, but the moment he glanced up and recognized who was standing there, his entire demeanor changed. His mouth opened slightly, his annoyance replaced with sudden nervousness. "Mr. Reeves," the manager stammered, his tone shifting from anger to forced politeness. I didn't realize you were here." Keanu didn't smile. He didn't offer the usual friendly nod that people expected from him. Instead, he simply tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I was just wondering," Keanu said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge, "is that how you always talk to your employees?" The manager's posture stiffened. His eyes darted to Ethan, who was still on the floor, now carefully placing the broken pieces onto a small tray. "Well, the manager cleared his throat. "I just expect a certain level of professionalism, you see. And Ethan here." He cast the young man a sideways glance. "Has had quite a few slip-ups lately." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "And yelling at him is supposed to fix that." The manager hesitated, clearly flustered. "It's just discipline. Keeps things running smoothly." Keanu let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words feel heavier. "There are better ways to lead people than tearing them down." The manager swallowed hard, giving a stiff nod. "Of course. You're absolutely right, sir." Keanu didn't say anything else. He simply glanced down at Ethan, who had finished cleaning up and was now standing, his face unreadable but his hands still faintly shaking. Ethan stole a quick glance at Keanu, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Gratitude, maybe. Surprise, definitely. But also hesitation, as if he wasn't used to people stepping in for him. Keanu gave him a small nod before returning to his seat. The moment passed, and gradually the diner returned to its normal rhythm. But for Ethan, something had shifted. The weight on his shoulders didn't feel quite as crushing as before. The hum of the diner had returned to normal, but for Ethan, everything still felt slightly off-kilter. He had spent years in jobs like this. Long shifts, demanding managers, customers who barely acknowledged his presence. He was used to being spoken down to, scolded for things beyond his control, and expected to keep smiling through it all. It was just part of the job. But tonight had been different. No one had ever spoken up for him before. People saw him struggling all the time, rushing between tables, working double shifts, apologizing for things that weren't his fault. But they never said anything. He was invisible, a fixture of the restaurant, someone meant to serve and then fade into the background. And yet, Keanu Reeves had stepped in, not just as a celebrity, but as a person. He had seen what was happening and had chosen to say something, to make his presence known, to remind the manager that Ethan wasn't just a faceless worker, he was human. Ethan still felt the lingering tremble in his hands as he wiped down a counter near the coffee machine. His mind kept replaying the moment over and over, the way the manager's tone had changed instantly, the way Keanu had spoken with such calm authority. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it had been enough. And then there was the look Keanu had given him, steady, knowing, like he understood something Ethan had never voiced out loud. Ethan swallowed hard, shaking his head as if to clear his thoughts. He couldn't afford to dwell on this. He still had 3 hours left on his shift, and there were tables that needed cleaning, orders that needed running. Whatever had happened tonight, it wouldn't change the fact that he still had rent to pay, medical bills piling up at home, and a mother who was relying on him. Pushing aside his thoughts, Ethan reached for the next order's slip and got back to work. Keanu sat in his booth, sipping his coffee and glancing around the diner. The tension from earlier had mostly dissipated, but he could still feel the weight of it lingering in the air. He had seen situations like this before, people overworked, undervalued, barely hanging on. He had been there himself, in different ways, at different points in his life. There was something about Ethan that reminded him of the past, of struggling to get by, of losing people and carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. His thoughts drifted back to a time when he had been just as lost, just as exhausted. Before the fame, before the recognition, there had been moments when he had barely scraped by. He had slept on friends' couches, taken whatever work he could get, and felt the crushing weight of grief too many times to count. It was why he never forgot what it meant to struggle. And it was why he wasn't about to let this night end without doing something. Ethan barely had time to think when he felt someone standing near the counter. He turned and almost jumped when he realized it was Keanu. "Sir, can I get you anything?" he asked quickly, falling back into the automatic politeness that had been drilled into him through years of service jobs. Keanu shook his head, just wanted to talk for a minute. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office as if expecting to be scolded for standing around. But Keanu caught the look and smiled slightly. "I won't tell if you won't." Something about the easygoing tone made Ethan relaxed, just a little. Keanu leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "How long have you been working here?" "About a year," Ethan said. "Before that, I had a couple of other jobs. Grocery store, a warehouse, some temp work." Keanu nodded, taking that in. "And before that?" Ethan hesitated. "College," he admitted. "I had to drop out after my first year." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ethan let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Life, I guess." He ran a hand over his face. "My mom got sick, and the medical bills started piling up. I tried to juggle school and work at the same time, but something had to give. So I dropped out and picked up more shifts." Keanu was quiet for a moment, studying him. "That's a lot for one person to handle." Ethan shrugged. "She raised me by herself. She gave up everything for me. I just figured, it's my turn to take care of her now." Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was something thoughtful in his gaze. He had met people like Ethan before, people who carried the weight of responsibility too young, people who made sacrifices no one should have to make alone. "You ever think about going back?" Keanu asked. Ethan let out a slow breath. "All the time," he admitted. "I loved learning. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that would make a difference." He shook his head. "But I don't have that kind of money. And even if I did, I can't just stop working. My mom needs the treatments." Keanu nodded, as if absorbing every word. "What were you studying?" "Medical science," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "I wanted to become a doctor, but that's not really in the cards anymore." Keanu tapped his fingers against the counter, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You know, I've met a lot of doctors in my life. Some of them had the best education money could buy. But the best ones, the ones who actually care, they're the ones who've been through something. The ones who know what it's like to struggle, to fight for something bigger than themselves." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the towel he had been using to wipe the counter. "Yeah, well, that's a nice thought. But nice thoughts don't pay tuition." Keanu didn't argue. He simply smiled, a small knowing smile, as if he had already made up his mind about something. Ethan didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change. The diner had thinned out considerably by the time Ethan reached the final stretch of his shift. A few late-night customers lingered over half-empty coffee cups, chatting quietly, while the sound of the kitchen staff cleaning up echoed through the small space. The air smelled of warm grease and brewed coffee, the scent clinging to Ethan's uniform like a second skin. Despite the exhaustion weighing down his limbs, he moved with the same determined pace, refilling cups, wiping down tables, and ensuring everything was in order. But beneath his usual routine, there was something different, a quiet unease, a restless energy in the back of his mind. Keanu's words still lingered in his thoughts. "You ever think about going back?" It was a simple question, but it had cracked something open inside him. He had thought about it every single day since he had dropped out. Every time he walked past the university on his way home. Every time he saw people his age talking about exams, internships, and futures that didn't feel like they were slipping through their fingers. He had wanted to tell Keanu the truth, that wanting something and being able to have it were two very different things. That he had learned to bury his dreams under the weight of responsibility. That people like him didn't get second chances, but somehow, when Keanu had asked, it had felt different. As if, for the first time in years, someone was actually listening. Ethan shook the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. Thinking about what-ifs wouldn't change anything. Across the diner, Keanu was still sitting at his booth, nursing his now cold coffee. He had barely touched his food, more interested in watching the quiet rhythm of the restaurant around him. He had seen a lot in his life: fame, fortune, success. But the moments that stuck with him the most were the quiet ones, the ones that reminded him of where he had come from, of the people who had helped him along the way. Ethan reminded him of himself in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had once been that kid, struggling, scraping by, not knowing if the next day would be any better than the last. He had lost people, made sacrifices, carried burdens that had shaped him into the person he was now. And maybe that was why he couldn't just walk away from this. He had been given kindness when he needed it most. Now it was his turn. As Ethan passed by his table, Keanu motioned for him to stop. "Got a minute?" Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen. The manager was still in the back, likely counting the register or preparing to clock out. As long as no one needed him immediately, he figured a minute wouldn't hurt. "Yeah," Ethan said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "What's up?" Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "I was thinking about what you said earlier, about school, about wanting to be a doctor." Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly. He didn't like talking about things that felt impossible. It made the loss feel more real. "I mean, yeah, but like I said, it's not really in the cards for me anymore." He forced a small, dismissive shrug. "It is what it is." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "What if it didn't have to be that way?" Ethan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. He pulled out a pen and started scribbling something down, his movements precise and deliberate. When he finished, he tore the page out and slid it across the table toward Ethan. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the writing, and his stomach flipped. It wasn't just a phone number. It was a name, a foundation, a scholarship fund. Keanu tapped the paper lightly. "I know people who help students like you, people who believe in second chances." He met Ethan's wide-eyed gaze. "If you want to go back, really want to, they can help you." Ethan's throat went dry. He stared at the paper as if it might disappear. I come understand," he said slowly. "Why are you doing this?" Keanu smiled, but there was something almost sad behind it. "Because I know what it's like to feel like the world is telling you no at every turn." He gestured around the diner. "And I know that just because you're here now doesn't mean you belong here forever." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper. "It's up to you," Keanu continued. "No pressure. But if you ever decide that you don't want to let this dream go, just call that number. Tell them I sent you." Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent so long accepting that his dreams were out of reach, that he had stopped allowing himself to even hope. But now, in his hands, was a lifeline. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do. Ethan sat in the cramped break room of the diner, staring at the piece of paper in his hands as if it might catch fire at any moment. The walls around him were lined with old notices, schedules, employee memos, and a faded Employee of the Month board that hadn't been updated in over a year. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a dull glow on the scratched-up table where Ethan sat. He could still hear the sounds of the diner through the door: clinking plates, quiet conversation, the distant hum of the radio playing some old song from the 80s. It was a soundscape that had become so familiar to him that it felt like background noise in his life, something he had accepted as permanent. But now, everything felt different. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, his mind racing. A scholarship fund. A chance to go back to school. A chance to start over. It didn't feel real. Keanu Reeves, a man he had only ever seen on movie screens, had not only noticed him but had helped him. No cameras, no grand gestures, no expectation of recognition. Just a quiet act of kindness, given freely. Ethan's throat tightened as the weight of it settled over him. He wanted to believe it was possible. He wanted to believe that a single moment, a single decision, could change the course of his life. But doubt clung to him like a shadow. He had spent years learning not to get his hopes up. Every time he thought things might get better, life had found a way to remind him of his place. Bills still had to be paid. His mother still needed her medication. Even if school was covered, how would he survive without working? It wasn't that simple. A sharp knock on the door startled him. "Break's over in 2 minutes," a voice called from the other side. Ethan exhaled slowly, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't ready to make a decision. Not yet. He still had a shift to finish. Keanu was still at his booth when Ethan stepped back onto the floor. The diner was nearly empty now, with only a couple of lingering customers scattered throughout. The staff was beginning to close down, wiping counters and stacking chairs. Ethan hesitated before approaching Keanu's table. "You, sticking around till we close?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Keanu smiled slightly, setting down his coffee cup. "Figured I'd see how the story ends." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, but it was hollow. "I don't think I have an ending yet." Keanu studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's okay. Some of the best stories take time." Ethan shifted on his feet, glancing toward the window where the dark streets stretched beyond the neon glow of the diner sign. "What if I can't do it?" he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "What if I try and I fail? What if I get my hopes up and it just doesn't work out?" Keanu leaned back slightly, folding his arms. His expression was calm, thoughtful. "You know, when I first started out in acting, I got rejected a lot," he said. "Auditions, casting calls. People told me I wasn't good enough, that I'd never make it." Ethan frowned. "But you did make it." Keanu smiled. "Yeah, but not because I was fearless. I was terrified, just like you." His voice softened. "I just didn't let the fear decide for me." Ethan swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. "It's okay to be scared," Keanu continued, "but don't let that stop you from trying." Ethan felt something shift inside him, something small but undeniable. Maybe he wasn't ready to make a decision yet, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. Ethan lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling as the city murmured softly outside his window. The streetlights cast a dull orange glow through the blinds, and the occasional honk of a distant car broke the silence. His mother's soft breathing from the next room was steady, a quiet reminder of why he had worked so hard for so long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper, running his fingers over the name and number written in Keanu's precise handwriting. It was still there, still real. He had told himself he'd decide later, that he needed time to think. But now, lying there in the quiet, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company, he knew the truth. He was afraid. Not of failure, of hope. Hope had been dangerous before. It had tricked him into believing things could get better, only to let him down. It had whispered promises that life never intended to keep. And yet tonight, for the first time in years, it whispered again. He turned the paper over in his hand, then sat up slowly, heart pounding. His phone was on the nightstand. His fingers hovered over the screen before he inhaled sharply and pressed the number. It rang. Once, twice. A voice answered, calm, professional. "Everett Foundation. This is Maria speaking. How can I assist you?" Ethan opened his mouth, but for a moment, nothing came out. He forced himself to swallow the lump in his throat. "Hi. My name is Ethan. Keanu Reeves told me to call this number." There was a brief pause. When Maria spoke again, her voice was warm, but businesslike. Mr. Reeves mentioned you might be reaching out. Why don't you tell me a little about yourself?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, not in this way. But as he sat there, staring at the peeling paint on his bedroom wall, he made a decision. He was going to try. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan kept his routine, long shifts at the diner, taking care of his mother, making sure everything remained steady. But beneath it all, something had changed. Maria had set up a call with one of the directors of the Everett Foundation, and to Ethan's shock, they had already reviewed his situation. Keanu must have spoken to them before he even made the offer. They knew his background, his financial struggles, his academic history. They had a program designed for students like him, people who had been forced to step away from education but wanted to return. It wasn't just tuition, it was support. Living expenses, medical assistance for his mother. It was more than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. But it wasn't just given to him. He had to prove himself. There would be interviews, assessments, steps he needed to take. It was real, but only if he had the courage to reach for it. Ethan found himself back at the diner one evening, going through the motions of another shift, but feeling like a completely different person. His mind kept drifting to the possibilities. What it would mean to leave this place, to step into a classroom again, to have a future that wasn't just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. Keanu was at his usual booth, sipping a coffee, watching him with quiet amusement. Ethan hesitated before walking over. "You knew they'd take me seriously, didn't you?" Keanu smiled. "I had a feeling." Ethan let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "They're actually offering me a real shot at this. It's insane." Keanu set down his cup. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "I think," he said carefully, "I'm going to take the shot." Keanu's smile widened, but there was something knowing in his eyes. "Good." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something light in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, hope wasn't so dangerous after all. Ethan stood outside the university campus, his fingers curled tightly around the strap of his backpack. The towering building stretched into the sky, glass reflecting the soft morning sunlight, students bustling past him with books tucked under their arms and coffee cups in their hands. The energy in the air was electric. Laughter, conversation, the buzz of possibility. He had been here before. Years ago, when he was just another freshman filled with dreams. Back when he still believed that hard work alone was enough to carve a future. Back before reality had crashed down on him. But today was different. Today, he wasn't a kid lost in his own ambition. He wasn't the waiter scraping by on tips. Today, he was a man who had been given a second chance. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. The Everett Foundation had moved quickly, arranging financial support, helping him reapply, walking him through every step of the process. He had spent sleepless nights reviewing old notes, brushing up on material he had long since abandoned, convincing himself that he deserved this. His mother had cried when he told her. For the first time in years, she had looked at him with something beyond worry. There had been pride in her eyes, hope. And now, standing at the edge of this new beginning, Ethan felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't keep up? What if he failed? A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You look like a man deciding whether to walk through the gates of heaven or turn back to hell." Ethan turned to find Keanu standing beside him, hands in his pockets, watching him with quiet amusement. Ethan let out a breathy laugh. "Something like that." Keanu nodded toward the campus. "It's a big step." "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "Feels surreal." "That's because it is." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You know, the first time I walked onto a movie set, I had no idea what I was doing. I thought for sure they'd figure out I was a fraud and kick me out." Ethan frowned. "You? But you're..." Keanu held up a hand, stopping him. "Doesn't matter who I am now. Back then, I was just a kid trying to make something of himself, and I was scared out of my mind." He exhaled. "But I showed up. I did the work. And eventually, the fear stopped mattering." Ethan looked back at the entrance to the university. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. Keanu smiled. "Nobody ever is." For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, staring at the world he had once thought was lost to him. Then, slowly he inhaled, straightened his shoulders, and took the first step forward. The second came easier. By the time he passed through the gates, the fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Keanu watched him go, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. The world was full of stories, and today, a new one had just begun.